Look, cards on the table, I know nobody cares about anything right now apart from Elden Ring, and I could be cheeky and SEO this by calling this video something like Still Wakes the Deep is the Dark Souls of walking simulators, but I mean, well, firstly, it's not. It's actually not remotely challenging at all. Now, I don't personally think that's a bad thing. I don't think Still Wakes the Deep would be improved if they made it harder. It's not that kind of game. It's a narrative experience. It's an interactive disaster movie. And I gave it a 4-star review over in VG247 because I happen to think it's an extremely well-made, well-realised game. But I do think, in one crucial way, they kind of made the wrong game. And I know that's a frightfully arrogant thing for me, a scumbag critic, to say. I'm not suggesting for a second that the talent behind Still Wakes the Deep needs any game design tips from me, an idiot, right? But hear me out. See, my favourite sequence in the entire game is the opening 20 minutes, and not because you get to stare at this guy's arse for as long as you want, which is cracking, but because it's all set up. It's all world building, the authenticity, that tangible sense of place, all the kind of stuff that the Chinese room is notably good at. It gives you a fleeting sense of normal life on a decidedly unexploded oil rig off the coast of Scotland in 1975, when the North Sea oil boom really started to boom, which to this day shapes much of Scotland's national character and charges its political discourse. Much of the modern independence movement, for example, starts with the North Sea oil boom and what it considers a squandering, a theft of Scotland's national resources by a sneering London-based ruling elite that has no interest in Scotland beyond its ocean boundaries and what that gives England control of. Now, whatever you, the player, thinks about the politics of that isn't important, but it sets the tone of the era, reminding us that the backdrop to all this offshore work life, these people being tempted out here by what is essentially danger money at a time when Scotland was absolutely hammered with poverty, rising unemployment, a crippling energy crisis and rampant inflation, was an uncertain world that was kind of on the brink. These were tense times, and they were aggressive times. And Scotland, to some extent now, but certainly in the 1970s, was a tense and aggressive place to live.
Merry fucking Christmas.
And if you're wondering where the hell I'm going with this, here it is. These people who you're on this oil rig with, your colleagues, the trade unionist guy who everyone thinks is a bit of a riddy, the bald bully with the National Front posters in his quarters.
Watch your mouth, McCleary.
The horrible, demeaning boss whose callous disregard for health and safety is exactly how the disaster starts. All of these people exude and are oppressed by toxic masculinity, which sustains this grim atmosphere that permeates everything and makes you feel very unsettled before there's even a hint of a disaster looming. I mean, you are playing a guy who's only here because the police are after him on the mainland after he kicked some guy's head in for looking at his wife. That's the protagonist. That's the hero. And half the people he meets are worse people than him.
Don't you answer me back!
And so we have this perfect setup for the horror trope of the real monsters being us all along. Our hubris, our aggressive tendencies, our callousness towards our fellow man. When the oil rig is eventually overrun by a writhing flesh organism that keeps turning your colleagues into the Cronenbergian abominations that menace you for the rest of the game, the specks of their humanity that are retained are the things that they felt most strongly when they were still human. There are morbidly poignant moments in the game where these monsters can be heard trying to remember to call their kids or asking you to tell their mum that they'll be home soon. You know, hammy, juxtaposed pish. The kind of cliches you'd expect from anguished faces trapped in a mound of alien biomass. A weighty fuck, man. If I was in that position, I like to think I wouldn't be sitting there going on about my wains. I'd be trying to say something funny, like, the doctor says there's a cream for it, or does this look swollen to you, mate? And a lot of it is really on the nose. Like, the big boss guy at the start who gives you a speech about how he's king of the rig, he ends up turning into a monster whose signature thing is that he's got a giant head, which is about as on the nose as making a game about fucking insomnia and calling it Alan Wake. But look, this is the game they wanted to make, and I gave them 4 stars for their trouble, so I'm not saying this is all shit or anything. What I'm saying is that the prospect of being trapped on a disintegrating oil rig is vastly more terrifying, to me anyway, than the idea of being stalked by a gloopy, fleshy sausage man that happens to have been taken over by an alien intelligence. In part because oil rig disasters are a thing that's actually happened to people. Just like the characters in this game, there are people in history who woke up one morning to start their normal shift, not knowing that it would be the last shift they ever worked, because a cruel chain of procedural failures for whatever reason resulted in them dying quite horribly in the middle of nowhere. And it wasn't because of something supernatural that got unleashed because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was because tired and overworked people make mistakes, or it was because someone's boss was more concerned about meeting a quota than they were about following health and safety guidance. Or it was because some corporation looking to maximize profit in the short term started cutting corners. This game certainly suggests that that type of thing is going on, and even without the excesses of capitalism, the basic need to sustain our civilization often involves trying to colonize inhospitable environments like the sea, or the shore, or shale mines in the middle of West Lothian. The east coast of Scotland contains many of the most wonderful places on earth. Forgotten ruins perched on cliff tops, picturesque villages nestled in natural harbours, the big CX in Dundee. But you'll also find loads of monuments to tragedies, bronze statues of people lost at sea or the families they left behind. You can probably tell that I grew up in Scotland. You can probably tell I've got a cold as well. But I've lived in a few places in the Central Belt and right up and down the East Coast, and almost everywhere I've lived up there had some kind of local tragedy in its past that resulted in a lot of men not coming home for dinner one night. And these tragedies leave long-lasting generational scars where there's an entire community of traditionally women all of a sudden raising children on their own, often at times in history where that was taboo, as well as being really hard, where families would end up destitute without a breadwinner and their children would end up being taken away from what was left of their communities. In our primary school, they had a whole wall about the Burngrange mining disaster that happened just up the road. Where I live near St Abbs, which you probably know better as New Asgard, you'll find a few monuments to the Eyemouth fishing disaster. In Aberdeen, you'll find a memorial to those lost in the Piper Alpha explosion, an event which I suspect Still Wakes the Deep takes a lot of its inspiration from. What I'm saying is that I appreciate Still Wakes the Deep's themes that evoke these tragedies that have shaped the character and history of the region in which it's set. Creativity doesn't happen in a vacuum. This game is so authentic to the region and to the period that I'm pretty sure the people making it are intimately familiar with the sort of things I'm talking about. These generational traumas, the fathers and mothers that don't come home, the risks people take in order to try and make better lives for their families, or even just to be able to get their kids a nice bike for Christmas. And what happens when risks become sacrifices, when the odds don't go in someone's favour? What are your final thoughts when you realise it's done, that the game is over? And now you've got to make peace with whatever you think is waiting for you on the other side of that. This is a game about all of that. But it's also about silly monsters, on-the-nose allegories and metaphors. I firmly believe that this could have been a solid, grounded, 6-hour interactive disaster movie about desperately trying to keep an oil platform afloat as your prospects for rescue dwindle away. With all of that emotionally charged intensity intact, with all the same characters, all the same beautifully realised environments, but without the kind of tedious literalism of actual monsters running about. You don't need to get chased by a big gloopy flesh abomination to know that oil rigs are fucking scary. They shouldn't exist. Apes have no business living out on the sea in giant metal trees that they've made for themselves, that they sit around eating sausage, egg and chips in and discussing the football results before they spend the day sucking liquefied dinosaurs out of the seabed so you and me can play Xbox and drive to McDonald's. The whole thing is mental and grotesque as it is, and I truly hope that one day someone is inspired by the extraordinary achievement that Still Wakes the Deep represents to make a disaster game like it that is just a disaster game. And just to be clear, the implication there is that it wouldn't be just a disaster game if it didn't have supernatural elements. There's a less is more thing being implied here. Just in case people didn't catch it. I know most of you probably... I know the Eurogamer audience is really discerning and, you know... but just in case... You know, some people think RoboCop's about a robot cop, do you know what I mean? I mean, it is about a robot cop, it's about... But it's not about... I mean, that's what it's about, but it's not about that, you know? Ian, how do you turn this off?